Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynicя, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to the Ukrainian community around the world. Today is Thursday, June 12th, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is David Kirichenko, a Ukrainian American who is a frontline Ukraine war journalist and an expert in autonomous systems, cyber warfare, irregular warfare, and military strategy. Welcome, David. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on.
And thank you for joining us today. To start off with, can you give us some information about your educational background and professional career?
Yeah, well, uh, I was born to Ukrainian religious refugees from the Soviet Union. They came to the United States in 1989, and because my family refused to renounce their faith and refused to join the Communist Party, they were forbidden from public life and attending university. So I'm the youngest of six kids, but the only one in all of my family to graduate from university and have an education. And my background before the war was actually in cybersecurity. And once the full-scale invasion broke out, I went to go volunteer in Ukraine, working as a translator on the border with Romania. And later, I was delivering humanitarian aid to the front line and taking refugees out, and gradually started to write more and more about what was going on. And there was a lot of demand, I think, especially being Ukrainian American and being able to bridge both worlds of communicating what is happening on the front line and giving a real perspective from Ukraine and being able to communicate it in a way to Western audiences so that they can understand what's going on. And found that the demand was there, and it was an important role where I could contribute, and started to gradually transition into being a frontline journalist and being embedded with the units on the front line and writing about what was going on and providing that perspective.
We need to define two terms: irregular warfare and asymmetric warfare. What is the difference between the two?
Yeah, so I mean, both irregular and asymmetrical warfare have been key themes of both Ukraine's resistance and key themes of the broader war between Russia and Ukraine. Irregular warfare is typically when I'd like to think of it as using unconventional tactics. Usually, it could be the use of non-state actors or a type of insurgency, sabotage, even psychological operations. And asymmetrical warfare typically involves one larger power and one smaller power, and the smaller power is able to leverage different types of strategies and abilities to undermine the strengths that the larger power has and balance out the fight. And for example, Ukraine's biggest strength in that regard has been the use of drones and neutralizing much of Russia's strengths on the battlefield, such as Russia's overwhelming advantage in manpower, heavy armor, and Ukraine has used drones so effectively to neutralize that advantage. And up until this point, Russia is relying now on motorcycle assaults and, of course, these glide bombs, and they have their own masses of drones. But it's become a much more balanced fight out there on the battlefield due to Ukraine's ability to leverage asymmetrical warfare. And on irregular warfare, I think one of the most concerning things has been the use of civilians or non-state actors and through the apps such as Telegram. Russia's been recruiting a lot of children and teenagers to deliver bombs in Ukraine to like attack recruitment sites and other points of interest. And you can imagine that both sides, like Ukraine, early on in the war also leveraged hacking into someone's bank account information, telling them that you should go and do this if you want to retrieve your bank account information. So there was cases of Russian pensioners throwing firebombs at Russian recruitment offices. And so, and I think one of the more interesting cases for Ukraine has also been the emergence of NAFO, which is the North Atlantic Fellows Organization. And you can think of it as people around the world with the cartoon dog meme on their profile picture on Twitter. And they were especially very active and prolific in the first few years of the war and continue to be in fundraise for Ukraine. And anytime a Russian propagandist posts some ridiculous statement, they go and post memes and ridicule the Russian propagandists, and it often infuriates them and has been an effective way in fighting a lot of this Russian propaganda that lives on the internet.
And so, how has Ukraine been using asymmetric warfare during the Russian invasion? And what is the most recent example of this?
Ukraine has used asymmetrical warfare pretty much on every front. If we think about the front line and the trenches themselves and how Ukraine has leveraged, even when it had artillery shortages and just shortage of weapons across the board, Ukraine was forced to dig really deep into its reservoir of human talent and Ukrainian ingenuity to build out now millions of drones per year and use that to destroy most of Russia's, especially its Soviet era armor that it can't easily replace. And we're just seeing that the Ukraine has been able to make the front line relatively static, whereas the Russians rarely can make any gains or breakthroughs. And given how much more manpower and resources that the Russians have, they're still not able to make any major breakthroughs on the front line. If we look at the sea, Ukraine only had one ship at the start of the war in 2022, and they had to get rid of that ship so that the Russians couldn't take control of it in March of 2022. They also lost over 70% of the Navy when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. And what Ukraine did is they built a tech navy of sea drones. And the Russians were attempting to enact a blockade with their Black Sea fleet of Ukrainian ports. They were launching missiles from these ships. So first, in the first few months of the war, the Ukrainians took out the Russian flag ship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the Moskva. That was the first time Russia lost one of its main ships since the 1905 war between Russia and Japan. And over time, Ukraine began developing these sea drones and using a mixture of these sea drones and missiles. Ukraine either damaged or completely destroyed a third of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. And now the Russians had to pull the fleet from Crimea and they moved it further away from Ukrainian shores. And now Ukrainian drones patrol the Black Sea and in a way are enacting a blockade of the Russian fleet. And the Russians can't come out of the port without immediately being threatened or having their ship sunk. And so you have these cheap drones taking out systems worth tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. You had in around the New Year, Ukraine took out two Russian helicopters, damaged the third. In early May, Ukraine took out two Russian fighter jets. Each one, I believe, was worth around $50 million. So you just see that the economics of warfare are completely, Ukraine has completely changed the equations. And by being able to develop such innovative and cheap tech at scale, it's allowed Ukraine to really turn the tide and balance out the fight to some degree between Russia and Ukraine. And I would say the most prominent example that's a top of mind for most individuals certainly has been the Operation Spiderweb, which was launched by Ukraine's security service, the SBU. And being able to take shipping, trucks, and then have the roof open and have remotely piloted drones fly out and hit Russian strategic bombers at one point, even 4,000 kilometers away. It showed that Russia's maybe very big and very strong, but its big greatest strength quickly can become its greatest weakness. Is now Ukraine using these cheap drones can make every single point across Russia a target, and nowhere is Russia safe, and that's going to cause a lot of panic and paranoia across the Kremlin. And now you have to defend so many more points. And previously, as Ukraine extended its long-range bombing campaign in the past 2 years across all of Russia, reportedly China's leader Xi Jinping had to ask Zelensky not to bomb Moscow when he was there during the Victory Day parade, and satellite imagery revealed that Russia was pulling air defenses from the Far East and putting it likely around Ukraine and Moscow, and putting air defense decoys in its place. And now Russia's going to have to think, can it actually get away with putting decoys around its Far East or other areas of Russia? And it needs to dedicate more resources to protect itself because everything's a target. And given that both on the Crimean bridge that Ukraine bombed in 2022 using a truck, and now Ukraine used trucks to have drones lift off and attack Russia's bomber fleet, uh, is going to have an impact certainly on Russian logistics, because now I believe the Russians rely on like around 70% of logistics across Russia to go by trucks. And this is for the war effort, and this is going to have a large impact in terms of delays, waiting times, inspections on trucks. You can even imagine in the future around even Murmansk in the Arctic, if Ukraine, there's going to be some technical challenges around potentially using Starlink, but I'm sure they're going to innovate, and they might be able to even deploy sea drones very far from Ukraine and start attacking other Russian strategic targets around the world. And last point on that is, I mean, Ukraine has been attacking Russian war criminals on 3 continents. Ukraine reportedly has helped, at the minimum, it seems, provide intelligence to rebels in Mali. And last July, they helped kill around over 80 Wagner mercenaries in Mali. And in Sudan, in the last few years, reportedly Ukrainian special forces operators have also been attacking Russian mercenaries. Also in Syria, where Ukraine also sent drone operators to help train Syrian rebels in the fight against Assad. And of course, Ukraine has been just waging attacks across all of Russia.
David, why has Ukraine become so proficient in drone warfare? And does this represent a strategic military advantage over Russia with this type of warfare?
In a way, we can say that Ukraine didn't have a choice. I mean, when you're fighting with your hands tied, even once you have weapons and you have weapon restrictions on what you can do with those weapons, when there's delays in aid coming from the West and you need to fight, like I mean, when your back is against the wall, you can't just stand there. You gotta do something and fight back. And so Ukraine had to look internally and you leverage Ukrainian innovation and ingenuity. And so you have volunteers spearheading so much of this innovation at the grassroots level of, like, kind of even like a business. You go to the customers in terms of the soldiers on the front line. You figure out what do they need. Okay, like we need better visibility. We need to better coordinate our strikes against Russian positions, and we need to speed up the kill chain at which we identify a target and get it back. So you have volunteers at the start giving drones to soldiers, setting up Google Meets so that they can like live stream their video feed and relay coordinates, and you just have this innovation at the grassroots level, just helping drive so much of Ukraine's adaptation. And it especially became more profound in late December of 2023 and into 2024 when Ukraine was starved of artillery shells in Avdiivka and the U.S. aid was the U.S. Congress was unable to pass aid for Ukraine, and the Russians just had a huge advantage with artillery and its mass meat grinder assaults against Ukrainian positions. And Ukraine, to a degree, has been able to substitute a lot of its artillery shortages with these uh, off-the-shelf FPV drones. I mean, the Chinese DJI Mavic drones to conduct reconnaissance, and then you have these cheaper first-person view drones that are worth a couple $100s, and you attach an RPG warhead against them, and you hit the Russian tanks, heavy armor, soldiers. And over the first 3 years of the war, it certainly gave Ukraine an advantage in certain areas, but of course, Russia was mocked heavily in the first year of the war. We saw Russian soldiers, instead of bringing proper supplies to the battlefield, they had victory parade uniforms in their backpack. And of course, just that the way the Russians fought, the whole world mocked and ridiculed them. But over time, even Russia's big war machine will adapt and it will learn. And I believe the pace at which the Russians are learning is increasing. And we saw that the Russians replaced their defense minister with an economist, a more business-minded to drive efficiency. And of course, that is going to be limited to how much the Russians can change their rigid structure. But Ukrainian soldiers certainly throughout the war have noticed that the rate at which Russia learns and copies is speeding up. And now, if Ukraine, say, makes some sort of modification to a drone that makes it more efficient, within a few weeks, the Russians either, like, say, they take down the drone, they see what the Ukrainians have changed, and they quickly make modifications and copy the Ukrainians themselves. And then you have the danger of that, Ukraine is doing a lot of this work by itself in terms of innovating with drone warfare and building its drones. But we need to remember that the Russians have the backing of the Chinese industry and the Chinese government and the Iranians. The Iranians have helped build drone manufacturing plants in Russia, and they're building these cheap Shahed drones, which torment and bomb Ukrainian civilians and cities on a daily basis, often launching hundreds of these Iranian drones into Ukraine. And of course, that has its own issue on overwhelming air defenses. And with Ukraine lacking air defenses, traditional air defense, like say even the Patriot battery, each launch can cost you millions of dollars. And are you going to be using air defenses that can cost you even a couple $100,000, 1 million, couple $1 million to take out drones worth 10, 20, 30, $40,000? So the drone warfare is quickly changing many theaters of warfare. And given that Russia has the backing of Iran, China, North Korea, you have this modern axis of evil working together to advance technologically. And for a time, many thought that AI-enabled drones would begin to dominate much more of the battlefield, and it's certainly playing a role, but we've reverted to more traditional means of drone warfare in the sense that now what we're seeing proliferate across the battlefield are fiber optic drones. So drones attached by a thin cable that ensures that it can't be jammed, and it gives it a stable signal regardless of the electronic warfare and the jamming. And so these things go slower and are a bit heavier, and the maneuverability is not as fast, but it means it can't be jammed. And so you can park these fiber optic drones on the side of the road and just wait for a vehicle to come by. Then you can lift off and chase it and destroy it. And now you have fiber optics becoming one of the main drone tools on the front. And unfortunately, the Russians have a head start here. The Russians were the first to deploy it at scale across the battlefield, and it was one of the reasons for Russia's success in Kursk. Once the Russians were pushing the Ukrainians on the flank, they narrowed the supply route, and Ukraine had to defend a very narrow salient. And Russia used these fiber optic drones that you can't jam to hit the logistics coming in. And then eventually your frontline soldiers don't have supplies and need to retreat. And China produces 80% of the world's fiber optics production. And they're certainly helping the Russians in this regard. And the Russians can afford to waste more money in terms of just producing and manufacturing at scale. And for Ukraine, I mean, Zelensky even said that China recently stopped selling Mavic drones to Ukraine and to other European partners, and there's Chinese representatives in Russia overseeing assembly lines in within Russia. You have Chinese officers in Russia on the like near the front learning, according to Reuters. I mean, you have the North Koreans learning how to fight in modern warfare with drone warfare. And so you have this axis of evil that's backing Russia with resources, with manpower, and it's Russia certainly beginning to close Ukraine's advantage in certain aspects of drone warfare, and with fiber optics even taking the lead for now. So this is a technological war. It's important to constantly be adapting and advancing technologically. And my worry is that, of course, Operation Spiderweb woke up so many of the Western leaders and military officials to the threat from these drones. But what they're not realizing is you have the axis of evil working hand in hand, developing these drones together and learning how to counter the West in a future battle. And you have Ukraine out there much by itself, developing drones to counter this axis of evil, and even fighting the axis of evil by itself with North Korean and Russian soldiers.
David, unfortunately, we're out of time. I do want to thank you for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thank you for having me.
I have been speaking with David Kirichenko, a Ukrainian American who is a frontline Ukraine war journalist and an expert in autonomous systems, cyber warfare, irregular warfare, and military strategy. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.